Paul, welcome to the Mill House.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
I've heard of your name well before I met you, and your legacy expands from the Northeast down into the Keys. What you've done with the bass world is very prolific. You had a TV show. You were good friends with Lefty. You're on Walker's Cay, and I think the conservationist side of you and your fundraising ability. I mean, at the BTT fundraiser in New York, you single-handedly got $1 million raised that night. And I think over the course of your life, what was very prolific last year is that you were awarded the Isaac Walton Award from the American Museum of Fly Fishing. That really culminates, that award, of your significant footprint on the world of fishing. How did you feel about all that?
I'm proud that, it's all worked out this way. I started with BTT when their inception, because I ended up being invited down to the Ocean Reef Club to fish, to guide. And so one day they're saying, hey, we're starting this organization, BTT, and, all the guides should come to this. And so I went to it, and I was blown away, because I walked in that room and there was Billy Payton, Stu Apt, and Steve Huff, and all my idols, these guys that I'd heard about for years and everything. And it was like, once they started talking about what they were trying to accomplish and everything else, I thought, man, I'm on board. I want to do this. And a lot of it was sort of selfish reasons, because they were talking about, tagging tarpon and seeing where they're going. And I was like, I want to know that, So I tagged the first tarpon with Tom Davidson, that they put a telemetry tag and they could tag it, and that tag at the time, I was scared shitless. Steve Vanini and Tom Davidson had caught this fish, and they called me. So I went over and we assisted everything else. But I thought, man, if we lose this tag at $8,000, it's the only one they had, and I'm trying to stick it,
Nerve-wracking.
Yeah. So anyway, and then, years later, 10 years ago, they asked me if I would, do something in New York. And I think that what people don't understand, because I heard a comment this year, like, what's New York, raising money for bonefish and this and that. But the relationship between let's say the financiers and everything of New York and Florida goes way back. Because if you look at Demick, the book of the tarpon, he was Jay Gould's partner. And Jay Gould cornered the gold market. And so he made a lot of money, and he wanted to come to Florida to explore the Everglades and shoot pictures and write about it and everything else. Even over at Bahia Honda, there was an old club there, and if you look at those old pictures at the turn of the century, they're all the New York financiers, or the guys that could afford the time to, go sporting, so the sportsmen of the era. And so there's always been this relationship. And it's, the people up there, they love the to bone fish. They love to fly fish and everything else. So when Tom Davidson came to me at one of the symposiums 10 years ago and said, could we do something in New York? I was actually sitting with Bob Rich at a table. It was taking place at the IGFA. And I turned around to Bubba and I said, Bubba, they want me to do something in New York. And he turned around and he said, well, if you need any help, I'll be there for you. And I thought, wow, that's great. So when I got back, I thought, okay, I just need to find the entertainment, and then I'll call my friends and see if they'll, help me do this. So I called Lefty, and I called Tom Brokaw, who was a good friend and that I knew from Orvis in the 80s and everything, and said, would you guys do this? And they said yes. And then I called you, and said,
right.
would you MC this thing,
Right.
And so it started, and it was sold out, so we had to get a bigger room. I called all my friends, Rick Bannerow from the Anglers Club, and John Fisher from the Urban Angler, and C.D. Clark for graphics and tried to strategically put some people together that would make this committee. John Applenapp got involved with this from Walker's, you know. And so we formed a committee, and the thing just grew, and it just grew and got more support, and everybody stepped up, and this year is on the 10th year it happened. We finally broke that $1 million, you know.
Yeah.
So it was pretty cool.
How much money have you raised throughout the years, throughout those 10 years?
Wow.
8 million?
No, because we never made, you know, $1 million. This is the first year. You know, probably, I don't know, $3 or $4 million.
Yeah, because you were averaging around 500,000 a year. I think.
I'm not quite sure what the figure is, you know.
But it's a lot,
a lot of money, yeah.
And it's the power of brotherhood and the power of passion.
Absolutely.
That's what it's all about. And we'll get into the striper conservation aspect here in a little bit. But let's go back. When you answer the phone, you know, yo, dude, you know. You're like the great Lebowski, you know. Where does that come from? Your roots in California?
Yeah. You know, and it was always used. I grew up in Southern California, in Newport Beach, you know. And it's funny because I listened to some of the guys in your podcast talking about Florida and the young days here and how it was and everything else. And I saw the exact same thing in California where I grew up. At the time, there was no development. You know, it was owned, the largest land grant in California was the Irvine Ranch, and it wasn't developed. And my dad was in the Air Force in the 60s, and then when Kennedy said we're going to the moon, he got a job at North American Aviation. It was in Southern California. We moved to Newport Beach, and the hills and everything behind me, there were no houses. The Back Bay was one of the last estuaries in California that had stripers in it from original stocking. You know, it just had all this life, you know. So, you know, for me, you know, it was one of those things that, you know, I just loved it. I just loved the outdoors. I was out there diving in, you know, whatever, tide pools, pulling abalone off rocks, you know, anything. And
was this an extension of your father's passion, or did you have any buddies that were doing that? How did a young kid in California all of a sudden just start doing all that stuff? How were you influenced?
Well, it's sort of funny, but my family was huge fishermen. My grandfather, at the turn of the century, he worked for Henry Ford, and he swept his floors. And Henry Ford, when he was 18 years old, turned around to my grandfather and said, "Jesse, what are you going to do with your life?" And so he said, "I want to go sell your cars, sir, out west." And so we had the first Ford dealership in 1915, and he did very well. Well, his passion was fishing. And so he got into it. He fished with Zane Grey. He fished with Bing Crosby, and it was a big deal in his family. I remember my grandmother. I never knew my grandfather, but at my grandmother's house, there was just all these thousands of old reels and rods. And I mean the nickel, silver, Von Hoff, you know, I mean, I wanted those. And she had promised me my whole growing up is, you know, whatever, you know, those are going to be yours.
Did you ever get them?
No. She had a little drinking problem, and she had a painter over one day, and he talked her out of them, said, "I'll get rid of all that equipment." She saved me one, and there's a story behind that one too, but she saved me one rod, and that was that. But on the same side, my father's side, my grandmother, when she died, was 101 years old. And I remember talking to her. They came west when she told me that she remembers shooting Indians out of the train that was bringing them west. The guys would roll down the window and they'd see an Indian and they'd all start shooting at them. You know, she remembers when Chief Joseph she was 3 years old and looking over a cliff. The family became huge loggers up in Hood's Canal in Oregon, and the Reed family. And she remembers when they would see the Indians, you know, below the surf or whatever, and little girl, and 2 days later, the cavalry came in chasing the Indians, and that was Chief Joseph trying to flee the country. So they had 100,000 acre reserve in Oregon, And my dad was, as a young kid, loved, going there, and they taught him to hunt and fish. So he had a passion for it. So growing up, every weekend, we were on the half-day boat or head boats, and I just took to it. My mother's the one that first gave me a little drop line when I was 3 years old, and I still have that picture of a Balboa dock in Newport, and I would never leave that dock. She would drop me. She didn't need a babysitter. I would be down there at 6 o'clock in the morning till it was dark, trying to catch stuff and grab crabs off the side, and then it just, it went on and on,
Right. Well, I had a presence in Newport Beach area. When I got hurt in 1981, I'd broken my neck, my back, and my leg. So I went to Marguerite Street, and what was that little town?
Costa Mesa.
Yes, I was there, and I had a spinning rod with a barrel sinker and a lefty deceiver. And I was on crutches, and I had a brace and a from my neck down to my waist because of my broken neck and my broken back. And I'd never seen a saltwater fish before. And I'd take my crutches and I'd crutch down to the end of the pier in Newport, and I would throw this barrel sinker with a spinning rod and catch bonita.
Yep.
Right when they'd come in.
Yeah.
And then when I felt better and got better, I would go out on a half-day boat, like you were just talking, or a full-day boat out to Catalina. And everybody's fishing with bait and they're chumming everything up. And I was on the bow of that boat throwing my fly rod, trying to catch these bonita. So it's like we both go back to the same, growing pains in Southern California.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Andy, because you see the changes, and I spent, my time in California, was almost equal to the time that I came east, and so hearing these other guys talking about how it used to be and how it used to be there, it's the same thing. The development finally was the Irvine Company built everything, the houses. I hunted jackrabbits with bow and arrow off these cliffs, that was my favorite thing to do, was go out and look for jackrabbits, So, but it all got developed,
Right.
You saw it. And that's why I met my ex-wife on a blind date in London, and her family had a place on the east end of Long Island. And when I came out there and saw it, you could walk out your back door. It was sort of like California was 25 years earlier, and you could hunt or you could fish, and it was all right there. By that time, California, it was toast. It was toast. Now it's, if it wasn't for Camp Pendleton, below, Laguna Beach, all
right,
the way
San
to
Diego area.
Yeah, it'd all be developed,
Right.
So, it's just development annihilated everything that was great about the.
What were you catching during those early years? Were you tuna fishing, yellowtail fishing, or just anything that bit your line?
The prime thing was when I finally started in 71, I learned to fly fish, and then I started catching bonita and everything else. But in the early days, the target species were, yellowtail was a big one. The bonita was another one.
Corbina?
There were corbina, but most of the half-day boats and stuff like that, you're looking, we caught black sea bass, which are now endangered. You can't even touch the things, but a lot of Pacific barracuda, and we ate everything. And the funny thing is I remember there was this guy on the half-day boat that his name was Pineapple Bill. And so he was a great fisherman, but he was a full-blooded Hawaiian. And we would keep the fish, and he would give us this sauce, and it was his secret sauce. And it's like, okay, you get a jar for this and a jar for meat, And we'd take it home, and I'd soak the fish, and it made everything, just like, wow. Everybody that would eat it would say, what is this, Well, it ended up that he gave me the recipe finally after years of getting to know, well, it was teriyaki, and nobody knew what teriyaki was, but all those fish that people would, he'd take all the bonita and everybody'd say, oh, you can't eat those things, so throw them away. Well, I'll take them. Well, you throw that in the teriyaki.
I tell you what, I used to bring the bonita back and cut the bloodline down the middle.
Yep.
And fry them with some butter, and they were awesome.
Yeah.
But everybody thought that since it was such a red meat, it was unedible.
Yeah, well, I can tell you about I had friends that were running tuna boats out of San Diego, and they were actually for albacore. And you would come back to the dock, and the albacore were longfin, and they'd usually trade them for cans. That was the deal.
Sure.
The recreational guys. These guys would sell them directly to the canners, And off to the side would be these huge fish sitting there. And I'd ask them, I say, what the hell are those things, And they'd say, oh, those are horse mackerel. And I say, horse mackerel? They look like giant tuna. They say, yeah, they call them bluefin tuna, but they're worthless. They pay us like 30 cents or whatever for cat food. And I'd just gotten back from overseas, and I had sushi. And I turn around to my friends and I tell them, I said, you guys, that stuff they get a fortune for in Japan and, in the Orient, so we should, so I pick up the phone, Yellow Pages in those days, and I find Japantown in San Diego. I call this guy and I said, hey, do you buy tuna? He goes, tuna? You got tuna? You come over, I take tuna. So I go over there.
That was so good.
So I go over there, and we got 3 of these things, and he looks in the back of the truck, and he looks and he says, how much you want? I said, how much you? He goes, oh, I'll tell you what, I give you $300 a piece. And we had just paid $20 for them. And we're like, 20 years old or what. And I'm like, dudes. Dudes. So anyway, it's just one of those things, seeing the evolution. And I guess the original thing, since we're back to dude, is I was a big surfer in California. That was my other passion, was surfing and fishing. And I made surfboards, and I went to Hawaii and everything else. Well, dude sort of started in the surf culture of California. But I thought, that's just stupid, So me and my friends would make a spoof on it, It's like, hey, dude,
and it stuck with you. In 2022.
But it was a joke,
and it still is.
And it stuck,
Oh, that is hilarious. One of the great books, if anybody's interested, is Zane Grey's book, Swordfish and Tuna, and he speaks in the book about not only the tuna up in Gloucester's area, but the swordfish near Catalina.
Yeah.
Did you ever experience that?
We would run across them here and there, and I got one swordfish story that, we'd see them, but by that time they were using stick boats to get them. Mm-hmm. And so one day...
Stick boats meaning they'd spear them.
Spear them, and they had the long platform on the front. And one day, a friend of mine, he had his father had a 52-foot Pacifica, and we'd go out tuna fishing and everything. We're coming back, and we see this big swordfish on the surface, just sunning himself, spinning. It's like, oh my God, get the thing, and we're running. So we slow down, we get the gear out, and we circle around, and we're just coming in front of this, and out of the corner of our eye, we see this stick boat. And it's like, geez, and the guy comes right in front of us, goes up in front, and sticks this fish. And we're like, wow. But we decided, let's watch and see what, So we sat there for like an hour and a half as he fought this thing and traveled around with the barrels and the whole thing. And when he brought it up, that fish was probably 600 to 700 pounds. And I don't think I've ever seen a swordfish since then that was that size. But I didn't, that's what my grandfather was after. In his day, the swordfish was the holy grail, the one to catch. And that's what everybody wanted. Because not only was it a trophy, he belonged to the Catalina Tuna Club and to the Balboa Island, Tuna Club and all that. And they were using linen lines,
right?
So he was using rod and reel. He wasn't spearing them.
No.
Yeah, and that's the whole Zane Grey story in that book, Swordfish and Tuna. It's fascinating read.
Yeah.
So they would get in front of those sunning swordfish when they're finning on the surface. They'd get in front and throw a bait out there.
No, they would come, but the stickers, the boat stickers. Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about what your grandfather and Zane Grey used to do.
Yeah. So what they would do is they'd try to, toss a bait or troll a bait in front of them, get something out. A lot of the stuff was bridled, they'd catch bait and then they'd try to, troll them. The bait at the time usually that they were using was bonita.
Right.
So, and they, as they come to find out, and I found this out with bass too, is that the tuna and the swordfish have a tendency to come up and sun themselves or to frolic on the surface and everything at slack tides. And it's the same thing with bass. That when I'm looking for, big bass and everything else, I'm looking not only for moon phase, but I'm looking for the tide that sort of brings the big fish that are normally out fighting current and hunting at slack tide. Now they're coming up and they're resting.
Do you find that with tarpon too sometimes? I think.
I think so.
Yeah, slack
I think
tide,
so.
You find them floating a little bit better?
Yeah.
So those big bass float like laid up fish?
They do.
Really?
They'll come up at certain times and everything. That's why I just had somebody turn around and I'm actually having a like machine problems or whatever, and I had these guys that say hey what we want to know how you're catching these big bass and everything else, and explain us how your machine and everything comes in and what you're using and everything else. And I'm like, machine? I don't use a machine, I just never did, even GPS and all that shit. I didn't have GPS when I started. I would do dead reckoning. It's like 15 minutes to this island, this fast, and this, heading, and that's how I did it, and it's the same thing, even down here in the early days, it was, I didn't really have GPS. I didn't use it. I just went and like, okay, there looks like a good spot, and to me, what I wanted to find out was, what are the fish's habits and why are they doing this? Where should they be? And to me, one of the main things is hydrology. If you don't understand how much the moon plays in fisheries, and how the hydrology of your area works, then you're sort of missing it. So I really don't use machines. I use them down here more than anything for water temperature. The same thing up north. I want to know if there's little breaks of water where they may be, where it's too warm and the stripers won't be there. Not like here where it's too cold or something.
Right. How did you, I don't know if you have any stories to wrap up California, but I'd like to ask you how you ended up in the Northeast, obviously with your wife that you met in London. So that introduced you to that fishery up there.
So when I first came out here, or not here, but to the Northeast, I was immediately. I grew up in California thinking that New York was an industrial wasteland, and why would anybody want to live there? But when I saw the east end of Long Island and Montauk, I was blown away. How beautiful it was, and here's this mythical that my whole life. That striped bass was like, the holy grail. It was like, wow, now there's a fish I want to catch. I'd read Outdoor Life and see a picture of a striper or something, and it was like, wow, I got to, and I tried it in California. When I was in high school, a guy came in and said, I got stripers today. And I made friends with this. I'd always see a fly rod or a rod in his car. And I'm like, that guy's fishing, I got to go talk to him. And he's like, yeah, I'm catching stripers in Back Bay. I'm like, show me, let's go together. I want to fish with you,
As you make mention of reading Outdoor Life, I've got a note here. I don't know where it came from you or somebody, where in school, one of the teachers called your mom and says, Paul's not going to turn out to be anything. He keeps reading Outdoor Life.
Yeah, she sent me home. She sent me home and a note and called my mom and
tell me how that transpired. How'd she catch you? What were you reading?
I had it in a notebook. I thought I was hiding it, and I was terrible. I was dyslexic as a child, and my mom, I went and saw people. They were just finding out about dyslexia and so forth. I had learning disabilities, and everything else. But I was a voracious reader, and especially for things that I was interested in. And boy, between hunting and fishing, that's all I wanted to do, So she sends me home, and says, you got to, you're out.
How'd she catch you? Tell me that.
Well, she came up behind me. She started wandering the room, and I thought it was good, like, do this aside. So I was holding a pencil, like, yeah, I'm doing it, and I'm reading everything else. And she grabs the magazine and pulls it up and said, what's this? And I just froze. And she said, this is it. I've had enough of you, and I'm calling your mom and go to the principal's office. You're going home. And I was like, oh. So I did. And my mom's like, you can't do that anymore. And, so, and years later, before my mom died, she actually turned around and she said, I wish I could call that Mrs. Miguel Fresh and show her, what you've done,
That's awesome.
Yeah, so it was pretty cool how it turned out. But
right. But so you were reading about bass in the Outdoor Life magazine.
Right.
Now you're in the Northeast, and it's now obvious, you're going to be fishing for them soon.
Right. So I get out there, I see this thing, and I thought, oh my God, this is great. So I get my fly rod, but then I'm a addicted fly fisherman. I started in Idaho when I was 16 years old, and I'm into it, So I go out and I'm everywhere trying to find a striper, and they're just not there.
Did you have access to a boat, or were you just going down the shore?
My father-in-law had a boat, but I started really from shore, and once we got married, the early days we weren't married yet and everything else, and so I started from shore, and I befriended some surf casters and some early guys that were actually fly fishing in Long Island, and so we just started looking. Well, then I find out that there's a moratorium on stripers because there is none. In 1985, they finally put a moratorium on the striped bass because they'd crushed them for years, and they almost just evaporated, gone between the commercial and mostly commercial, but the recreational angler.
Everybody was killing them.
Everybody. So they had a moratorium on them. So in the early days, I never saw one, but it's sort of funny because, everybody, the sort of how the flats, came about and everything else. Everybody, would say, oh, you got to, fish stripers at night, 60 feet of water. They're night critters. You got to. And so, we were sort of partying at night.
You were busy.
So, you'd go out in the day and, I think I'll go down by the beach and look and whatever, And they lived down in Southampton and Shinnecock Canal, and Shinnecock has these unbelievable flats, white sandy flats and everything else. So I'd go down there, and I wasn't, really expecting to see, but I just want to go fishing. And then you'd start seeing a few. It's like, holy shit, that's a striper, And in the early days, mostly bluefish and stuff. And then by the time I started working for Orvis because I wanted to get into the fly fishing business. Before that, I'd sort of come from California and we did a lot of different things, but I wanted to start fly fishing, or get into the business. So I thought the best way that I could do that is if I could get a job part-time at Orvis and get in the industry some way. So I did. I ended up, running the Orvis fly fishing department in New York City. And so I would go back and forth, through the Hamptons, and gradually the striper all of a sudden really started coming out. And my goal is that I wanted to, either start a lodge someplace, or I wanted to maybe Canada for Atlantic salmon, or we could have a lodge in Alaska, or all these things. And then the more that the saltwater fly fishing started exploding and growing, and in those days there really wasn't any. So we started with Randy Carlson. I started the first Orvis saltwater fly fishing schools, and that was in the 80s at some time. And we started teaching classes on it and everything else. By the time he's the one, Randy, that said, you should do a store, you're always out in the Hamptons. Why don't you do a store out there and, start? And so I did, in 1993 or whatever, I started a store, and I thought, I don't want to be stuck in a store the whole time.
Did you hate it initially or right away? It was a probably a really interesting concept. I'll have my own store. I can sell But how long after that did all of a sudden you realize this is not going to work?
Well, it's pretty early on. I'd already worked retail, with at Orvis and everything else. But really, all I wanted to do was fish. But it was great because it really, it was probably one of the wisest decisions I ever made was working for Orvis in that store, because I met everybody that fly fished in New York. So, from Jimmy Buffett to you name them, all the way down the line. Every CEO of Morgan Stanley, of all these firms, they all fly fished. And if they fly fished, they came into Orvis, And so when I started the store, I thought, okay, this will be great in the Hamptons, but at least I won't have to commute to the city, but it was still retail.
Right.
And so I decided early on, actually when I was just in the process of putting it all together, I'm going to get my guide's license. And this way, my wife can't, say that you can't go fishing. So,
your office was just moved to the shallow water of the Hamptons.
yeah.
So when you first got started, were you in a bay boat chasing those blitzes, or did you bring a skiff up there and you started pulling the flats and getting your program dialed?
There was actually a guy that had brought skiffs there, Jeff Northrup. And Jeff was over in Connecticut, and he was selling skiffs, And Jeff didn't have really the water quality of the flats over in that end of the thing. And he would do a little or, whatever. But Jeff was the first one to bring the skiffs up and everything. So I ended up, my friend and I, James Kang, ended up like, we got to do this. Let's buy skiffs, So we went to Jeff, and Jeff sold us the first 2 skiffs, And James guided for me, and I started the store, and we started pulling around and started looking, And that's just at the time that I met John Applenap, comes rolling into the store. So and he was, his family was Walker's Cay, and I think it was the first year that we started, and I'll never forget it because they pulled in across the way and they open up, and John's got Jack, his mate on the Sea Lion 2, which was their boat, and Jimmy, the captain, and the beer cans come rolling out of the car and rolling down the street.
The party has just arrived.
And they walk in, and they're all in shorts, and we start talking and everything else, and he says, I'm getting a skiff too, it should be, whatever, we're using this right now, and as he's leaving, he turns around and he says, I'm going to become your newest best friend. And I was like, oh, okay, And Jack, who's a card and a half, as he's walking out, John's walking out with you, he turns around and he says, he's not kidding. So, and then John and I started this relationship. I'd get 10 phone calls a day from John. Finally, my wife's like, look, can you tell John and your girlfriend not to call during dinner? But John was, he was running his dad's company, and so he wasn't out there all the time. He'd come out on weekends and everything, but he'd live vicariously when he was in his office. It's like, how's it going out there? You catching them?
Right.
So.
Well, that's still one of your longest best friends.
Yeah.
And during those number of years, tell me about the relationship of Walker's Flip, Walker's Cay Chronicles, and John Applenap.
So John and I became friends, and weirdly enough, we had 2 kids who were almost born on the same days, same ages, same days, and everything else. And so we started going to Walker's, and we did, at the time, there was the Sea Lion 5 that supported the island infrastructure with, and it was basically an old oil rig boat, but it had a 70-foot back end, wooden back end, and it was a chugger. It only went 5 knots or whatever. But we would put 2 skiffs on the back, or tow 2 and put 1 on the back. We'd take 3 skiffs. We'd all get together. The girls would stay on the island, and we'd go all over the Bahamas. And we'd sit there and say, okay, let's go look at this. this looks interesting. So we'd go over and we'd, choose our destinations and putter around at night and arrive at the destination and go explore and look. And this was long before the days of, the Pelican Bay and North Riding Point and all those places hadn't been built yet. So it was a real magical time. It was a real party time.
For sure.
But it was
a real great time.
It was a great time.
Well, you're speaking about being one of the first guys chasing bass, striped bass with flat skiffs, and one of the first guys doing a lot of, exploratory stuff over in the Bahamas. I mean, your fishing eyes have really seen a lot of great stuff.
Yeah, I've been fortunate, I tell you, I'm the luckiest guy alive. I never expected to make it past 30 years old, to tell you the truth, because of past things. But, it was just, I decided to do something and it just worked out, And like I said, it's like the evolution of working at Orvis and meeting everybody. The first person when I opened my store that sent me a letter of congratulations was Bob Rubin. At the time he was Secretary of the Treasury. When I first met him, he was he was the chairman of Goldman Sachs, and Bob I sold him his first fly rod. But all these guys and that I had met for that. And then when I started guiding, everybody thought, I want to sight fish. I got to go to the Florida Keys. I got to go to the Bahamas. When they found out that it was in their back door, it just exploded, and so I started buying more boats and hiring and training more guides, and it caught on like wildfire,
Tell me what it looked like out there in those early years with the flat skiff and pulling the shallow flats.
It was awesome. It was unbelievable. You had the recovery, as I say, the greatest conservation success story of all time in this country, because the striped bass was gone. It was into oblivion, but they shut it down. And in 10 years, Mother Nature made it came back like, you couldn't believe it. If I went out, I used to fish a lot with Bob Popovics, became a really good friend, who's the greatest, fly tire alive, in my opinion, saltwater fly tire. And Nick Curcione, who was from the West Coast and had moved out east, and they were all fishing at night and fishing the beaches and everything else. And John and I would turn around and say, Bob, you guys got to come out. You got to see this. And Bobby at the time was filming. He's like, I got this camera. I'm going to film some of this stuff. So the early days, if I went out and I caught 10 fish on the flats, 36 to 41 inches, 5 of those would be that, because at the time, the size limit was 36 inches. So, you catch 10, 5 of those fish are going to be between 36, maybe 41 inches, big fish.
Big fish. Is that a 20-pound fish?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So every day. That's sort of, not every day, but pretty much that was your thing. If you caught 20, 10 of them. A few years later, they decide that, there's so many fish now, it's all good. We're going to lower the size limit. And this is where I really got involved with the conservation and fighting these battles. And this was 96, 97, whatever. And so we'd go to these hearings saying, why don't you guys err on the side of caution? Why do you want to lower give them another year to spawn? Why kill them? Oh, there's plenty of fish. And then a few years later, they say, oh, there's so many. Let's go to 2 fish at 28 inches. And because of this, and it was basically the commercial guys wanted more tags and be able to take more. So they said, yeah, let the rec guys take 2 because we get more. So they increased the kill. And so
there was not a slot. It was the 26 inches to whatever.
That's right.
So you can kill a 40-pounder.
That's right. And they stacked them like cordwood.
And
years.
Obviously those are the fish. Those are the breeding fish.
That's right. And so for years, it was so sad to see at the docks, just like cordwood, you'd see these barrels filled with these big breeding fish. And, it was like, wow, but the blitzes in Montauk, the stuff that most of the fly fishing and even on the flats, my theory is that the flats fish and the blitz fish that we see in Montauk are the same fish. They're the younger ones that live in the estuaries that, until they get to a certain size or whatever. And then they basically move offshore, move into the rips and bigger baits and everything else. I don't think I've taken, and there is areas that you'll take flats fish, up north where you get the bigger fish will hang and come up on the flats. In our areas, we're mostly fishing the estuaries. I don't think I've ever taken a fish over 25 pounds on the flats in our area. I've had them up in Nantucket. I've seen 40-pounders coming down the flats, Block Island, a lot of the different areas. You'll see big fish.
Do they eat pretty well on the flats?
Yeah, well,
is that pretty easy fish to catch?
Not really. And this was, one of the how to figure it out and everything else. And this is indicative of how I fish now too, is that, everybody talks about tides, and tide is just a measurement of height. It just gives you, here's high tide, here's low. It's just a measurement. I think that a lot of these fish, and especially stripers and everything else, it's current and current velocity, what turns them on. And I've, when I'm talking about these guys that want to write a chapter on how to catch big fish and everything else, I learned more from flats fishing and striper behavior and how to feed fish and how they react to, to things on the flats than any place. And so I could sort of drill in, to what they were. If it's slack tide, the fish would either, sometimes they'd be floating out in the middle or whatever, but most likely they're sitting in a trough and you'd see them, and there's a fish. You throw at them, wouldn't pay attention. No. And bluefish, the same thing.
And bonefish too.
Yeah.
It's because the tide brings the bait.
That's
brings
right.
the food. And it's all a smelling game.
And
if there's no current, they can't smell anything.
Yeah. And so, that was the key, was that it was current. So I would go, and I could tell this a lot in August when the water gets warm and the metabolism is a little different and everything else. And I would go out and I would find fish because they'd hold, smaller fish. Maybe there's 15 holding in a trough someplace, or you could throw all day long at them. They wouldn't touch it, But, as time, an hour or two later, all of a sudden now you got a couple sniff at it. They'll come over and sniff, and then, hour and a half later, boom, every cast, you're getting them. So in the summer, I used to tell people, they'd say, "Oh, should we leave at 8 o'clock?" I'd say, "No, we're going to leave at 10:45. They're like, 10:45? I said, "Do you want sight fishing?" Yeah. Well, we could throw at them, but I don't want to go blow the fish out. I want them there when they're going to eat.
Right.
So that's when I would try to time, because the current velocity in certain phase in there, they're going to start moving. They're going to start doing their thing.
So I was just going to ask, because I've never fished up there. So in the early days when you're pulling the flats, if you catch 10 fish, are you getting 30, 40 shots, 50 shots?
Oh, easy.
What's
Really?
it like? What's it like up there now?
It's tough. It's, I'm running like I've never run before. I could leave my dock space or where the launch ramp was and literally go 50 yards and there'd be fish. I'd go right out in front of the beaches. Every beach had fish on them. It was biblical, in a sense. It was, you go and at certain times, here comes 30 fish, here comes 20 fish, here comes, not the big ones, but, here comes school, and, so you had a lot of shots. Now, I'm trailering to places, and I never trailered, I'd go to maybe an estuary here, an estuary there, mostly I launched out of 3 Mile Harbor in East Hampton and, go from there. And then I started, the more guides that I trained and everything else, and as it sort of got, somewhat crowded, I wouldn't say crowded, there was only 5 or 6, whatever. But I started thinking, okay, wait a second here. And I had a house that overlooked the bay. And so I'd see everybody go one way, and I thought, I'm going to go looking back, And so we started,
Did people try to follow you, knowing your fame and your abilities to find and catch fish?
Yeah.
You ever find that? Kind of like, where's Steve Huff going? I'm going to follow him.
Yeah,
Here goes Dixon.
So in the old days, they used to memo date boats, so which was they give you the boat manufacturers to give you a boat and everything. So I get Seacraft, wants me to have a boat and stuff. And there's a local dealer there, and so he's like, oh yeah, I'm into it. So the first I go pick up the boat. And it's got like Hampton Watercraft Fishing Team, and it's all dolled
Fancied
up and
out.
fancy, and it's funny because that was one of the years I started going down to Harker's Island and guiding down there when the herring run disappeared up in November for us, and Bob Clouser was down there with Lefty and everything else, and Bob's like, so, it's you, Captain Billboard. And to this day, I talk to Bob, and he's like, Captain Billboard. So,
were there any confrontations out there? I mean, you hear so many stories in the Keys.
Once in a while, I don't, it's like, you'll run into stuff, and especially in Montauk in the fall, because now it's become a real shit show, I hate to say.
Because on a blitz, everybody races over and they're on top of each other.
Yeah, and it's just, and the guides and everybody pretty much cooperate, but now there's crowds of people and they just don't know, and
Right.
so they're going to run and gun and charge into the fish. And so you try to educate nicely. You might putter up to somebody and say, hey, you'll do much better. But a lot of times you're going to get the finger, and who are you to tell me,
When was the last time you killed a striped bass?
God, I don't know. Maybe 12 years ago.
Wow.
I don't know. But we could see it happening. I mean, it's just and the funny the thing how I love striper. I mean, whatever. It's a great eating fish. So I get the eating aspect of it. But we would go out and get what we call dragger bass, and the draggers would go out. And intentionally or non-intentionally, what they do is a dragger it drags the bottom for bottom fish.
It's
for
a bite
fluke.
catch.
Yeah. So it was considered. So they were allowed to keep 12 stripers as bycatch, or that they could keep. Well, they'd go out and they'd see, oh, there was a school of big stripers. So they'd net them. They'd drag through them. Well, they'd take their 12. But there'd be 100, 200, 300 fish floating on the surface and being dragged in the net. And so when I would run across that, then I'd say, geez, do you guys want a bass? They're going to, they're dead.
Right.
So I used to take, if I could, if I found one, I'd take it home, or if my client wanted it or whatever. But from day one or whatever, I will not kill a flats bass. I've killed one in my life. And what happened was I remember Lefty always turn around saying, well, you don't burn your golf balls, do you? So, which is true, you know. But everybody says, I said, because they become local fish. Early on, the fish are migrating and they go up the coast and they, go to Nantucket. It's just like us, you summer in the Hamptons, you summer in Nantucket, and you go to the Cape, and that's how it works. They go up. And so everybody says, well, how do you know that? And I said, I'll tell you what. Years ago, there was this fish, and some kid had snagged it or something, and it had this orange popper on the back of it, or they use them for snappers, and it's just a foam popper, but it was on the back of this fish's dorsal. So when you see them swimming around, it's like, look at that, what is that? Oh, it's a fish. And through the season I'd see that fish over, let's say, in Napeague and East Hampton and everything else. So wow, that's sort of cool. I saw that fish for years. The next year he'd be back. And then the next year he'd be back again, a little bigger, and it's
how cool.
And that's why I thought these, they all migrate through, but these are the Hamptons fish. These are the guys that stick around in these estuaries, and
this is their house, kind of like a salmon going up the same river that he was born to spawn.
Yeah.
I remember a couple of years ago we were fishing down in the ocean here, fly fishing, and we saw that big old tarpon with that massive silver Sabile lure coming down his face. going south, and the next day he was coming back north. Remember
right,
that?
Right.
It's the same-
Periodically, you'll see that fish that's got a scar or something that he's dragging. But let's go to really a happy chapter of your life with the Pirates Party, with all your pals and the big party that you had with all these famous anglers and guides.
Yeah. So in the early flats days, and John and I are out there, and we're talking on the phone every day, and we're discovering stuff and looking at stuff and tides and trying to figure it out, and it's great. It's like, wow. And one day John says, we should try to get Lefty up here to see this stuff. And I said, yeah. And I think Popovics had come with me, So, and maybe Curcione too. But anyways, so John had met Lefty in New Zealand, I believe. And just knew him sort of briefly through that and became friends. And because of the Chronicles, Lefty knew about the Walker's Cay Chronicles and stuff. And so, so it turns around and I said, well, Lefty, why don't you call him? And I knew of Lefty and I saw him at all the shows, but I'm not the type of guy that, I could never, hi Lefty, how are you? So I'd observe I'd watch him cast and everything else, But anyway, so John calls, he says, well, maybe we should call some of his friends and invite them too so that he's more inclined to come. So I said, all right, well, I'll call Bob and Nick and those guys and everything. So he calls Lefty, and Lefty says, let me check my calendar. So it all ends up that Lefty comes back and agrees to do it. Everybody, says we're going. So for 5 years, we did this thing called the Pirates Party. And everybody started coming to it, all our friends and everything. Jeffrey Cardenas from down here, and
Gordy Hill,
and John Cole and Peter Matheson, and all these great writers, John Alexander, great Jimmy Buffett, the parties, Jose. I got a funny story where, one of the guys, Sean McCarthy, had this beautiful house, that he built. And he was one of my earliest, clients and everything else. And he built a house that looked like a Maine hunting lodge because he was from Maine. He says, I want to throw the party, So, okay. So we all are going over there. And this is the year Jose shows up with a girl that he's dating at the time, And Jose I met Jose through a show, and sort of another funny story, but he comes up and he's going to do this, and Lefty's there. And so we start filing into, the people are just starting to show, and Jimmy Buffett shows up first, and Sean's got this beautiful back bar, and Jimmy comes in, Paul, what's happening? And he doesn't, really know anybody, but Jimmy and I go to the back of the bar. We're sitting there talking about mutual friends and, and some of the stuff that he's been doing, and Jimmy loves to fish. And so, we sit there, and the next thing it piles in with people, and Jose doesn't know anybody, so he comes up, hey Paul, how are you doing? And I said, oh, Jose, hi Sue, how are you doing? This is Jim, Jose. So we sit there talking for 20 minutes. Everybody's having drinks. It's the four of us, and we're as close as you and I. And all of a sudden Susan turns around and says, hey Paul, I hear Jimmy Buffett's supposed to be here. Where is he? And I turn around and Jimmy starts laughing. And I point, right there. And Jose had just chimed in like, yeah, Paul, where is he? But Jimmy didn't have his hat on, He was balding. And they just, and talking about Jose is like, oh, wow. Just a funny story. But it was a great group of guys, I mean, it turned into such a fun learning experience. Ed Jaworowski, who's a tremendous, wrote the books with Lefty.
The casting.
Yeah, just all these guys that, the Glenn Mickelson, the great guys of Fly Tires, Joe Blados, who did the Crease Fly, Brian and Sarah Horsley, from the Carolinas, all these friends that, just said, man, this sounds like fun. Let's do it. And Lefty was blown away the first year. That's what really sealed it. He couldn't believe it. He said, I've fished all over for everything, and I've fished for stripers, but I've never sight fished for them, and this is great. Do you think we could do this next year again? Well, sure. So that's what started it. And so for 5 years, it was just this epic great gathering of some of the great names in fly fishing,
How did it ever dissolve? The fishery went away, then everybody stopped coming?
It was really expensive for John and I, because and we got all the guides or anybody that had a boat and and all these guys to do it because it grew, and next thing you got 25 people and you got 10, 15 boats and you're putting guides and you're putting people up and
it's like a Woodstock.
Yeah, I mean it was great, but then scheduling stuff. Lefty had to go here, this would happen here, and so it slowly faded. I don't think it faded so much for the fishery, because it was just
party got too big.
Yeah, just
Look, this is totally different from the TV show you had on ESPN, correct? The Guide's House, or
no? This is just a party they had called the Pirates Party.
Yeah, we just called it the Pirates Party, and just great friends having fun. And there's actually our friend Richie had an old tape that he had shot. I hadn't seen that thing, and it was like, oh my God! And we all look so young.
Well, I was gonna say you fished with all these legendary guides like Lefty Cray and Jimmy Buffett, but. Like, what is it like to spend the day on the water with Roger Waters, the biggest rock and roll star of all time?
Roger, I love Roger. I think he's a genuinely caring human being. He's doing some great stuff in some other areas and everything else. He's very outspoken. He has his views and everything, but he's a good angler. He's passionate about it. And he's a fun guy, And I asked him once, this is a pretty cool story. I said, so Roger, how did you ever get into fly fishing? And he says, well, mate, I'll tell you what. When Eric Clapton was in my band, in the early 80s, and he keeps asking me, he says, oh, you got to come fly fishing. And so, he's like, fly fishing? What the hell what are you talking? So he kept bugging him, and finally Roger says, I acquiesced and said, okay, let's go fly fishing. So they go up to the Tess River and everything else. And he says, so I get up there and we put the rods together and Eric hands me this rod. He says, okay, now I'm going to show you. See this? This is how you do it. And he goes like that, and Roger's like, okay. And he says, okay, see you later. And he walks upstream, he says, And so he says, I sat there, and all of a sudden, I thought, all right, what the hell, and he said, I caught a grayling. And he said, then I caught two. And by the third one, I'm like, I fucking like this. So anyway, so that's how he started fly fishing. And he ended up buying this place on the Tess. And by this time, he said he was, he kept driving by this place that was beautiful. And just like, man, that's the place I want, that if I ever, one day he hears it's for sale. And so he goes up and with his ghillie and he knocks on the door and, says, I hear your place is for sale. It's like Lord something. And he said, by this time, Pink Floyd is going strong. We're making some, bucks. And so the guy says, oh, no, I'm sorry. You've got this wrong. This isn't for sale. He said, well, mate, if you were going to sell it, how much would you want? He said, well, it's not for sale. But, I couldn't get any less than, like 350,000 pounds. He says, I'll give you 400,000 pounds. I says, okay. So,
money talks.
Yeah. But Rogers helped a lot with BTT. He's a good cat. Like I said, he's a good guy. I really like Roger and the stories, you can imagine, the times. And he's so talented. He invited me to go to, when he did The Wall, the movie and everything else, and explained a lot of his philosophy in life because he'd lost his father and his grandfather in wars, so The Wall was sort of his rendition of this tragedies and how everything came about. But it was a hell of a party because he's like, mate, we're gonna have this party afterwards. It was fun.
Yeah.
So
tell me about a Lefty story. Possibly the most famous fly fishermen, one of our greatest grandfathers, other than Joe Brooks and a few others. But Lefty is Lefty. You got a great Lefty story for us?
If I probably had long enough to think about it, but and I hate to, because Lefty, is such a great. But one of the things I remember is Bob Popovic's filming one day, and I'm poling, and Lefty's on the front and everything else, and so I tell him, I said, Lefty, you got a fish coming about 50 feet out, 11 o'clock, and so he whips the rod up, and something happened, whether the fly caught something, and the whole fly line comes up, and it lands on top of him, and it's around him, and both Bob and I, Bob's filming, and both I'm looking like, I'm not saying anything. but Bob, to this day, that included that film, and Lefty loved that, because it was like, it happens to the best of them,
Absolutely.
And so, and Lefty was like, Bob, you got to put that in there,
He was real.
Yeah.
He was real. No ego. He was just the bomb in so many ways.
And just, the stuff about how he ate, every day he'd take a nap. Every day.
On a boat?
On the boat.
Or on ground.
That's right. He was like, okay, time for my nap. He'd take a 20-minute nap. But it was like, what? Wait, what are you napping? But he just did that. He would not eat, he'd do peanut butter and jelly or whatever, and his meat had to be, and maybe this is because of the war, I don't know, he was afraid, but it had to be black. Burnt,
And no green.
No green.
No green.
No green.
No greens.
I mean, it was just, Lefty was Lefty. Yeah. And I told Lefty years ago, I said, you should write a joke book, because nonstop one-liners.
Yes.
And I think, I started thinking about this later after he died and everything else, because he had so many prolific jokes and everything. But, Lefty was in the Battle of the Bulge. And I think that sitting in those foxholes,
right,
it was joke time. And that those guys in my dad's era too, and everything else, the jokes, the one-liners and everything else, I think that was a way of coping maybe with the war, because boy, it was endless.
Yeah.
He would go on, and he was funny as,
crazy.
It was unreal.
How did you get to the Keys? We were talking a little bit earlier, you're Southern California, the Northeast with the stripers, and you've got a great presence down here. In the lower Keys. When did you start coming down, and how did you get here?
That's another good one. So Orvis, I guess, had, they were going to start at the Ocean Reef to start a thing, and so they came down and told the guy that was opening the store, that they should maybe, because he was going to revamp all the guides. There was a lot of old guides at the Ocean Reef, a lot of guys that were retired, so he was going to change it, and the fly fishing was going to become the focus and all this. So Orvis said, you ought to call this guy because he's got this clientele and everything else. So the guy's name was Bruce Miller. And Bruce called me. He was opening up the shop. He was a member of the Reef and the Anglers Club over there. And he said, would you consider coming down here? And I said, I don't know. I don't really know the Keys. He said, I'll show it to you. Don't worry, but if you'll bring the clients, this is the deal. And I said, well, let me come down and talk to you. Well, at the same time, weirdly enough, I'm filming the Walker's Cay Chronicles with Flip. And so I turned around and I said, hey, Flip, do you know this guy, Bruce Miller? And he said, yep. I said, what do you think of him? And he said, nobody knows it better. And I thought, wow, that's pretty, but that's all he said, So I came down and they were revamping the guides. So the guides that he had chose, he had this little meeting first, was Dwayne Baker, myself, Andy Thompson, Dave Wiss was there, and I forget. So that was pretty, and he had this little meeting. And as you know, two of the greatest guides going is Andy Thompson and Dwayne Baker.
Absolutely, without question.
It's just off the charts good. And Andy and Dwayne, I still see Dwayne quite a bit and everything. Andy and I are really good friends because I've known Andy since he was, and he lived down the street from Flip and everything. So so they said, would you come down? Would you do this and everything? So I agreed to come on down. The thing that got me, and it's funny because at the same time that Bruce says, I'll show you everything. So I go to Walker's, and there's a guy over there, Bob Rogers, and he's an Isla Morada guy, the old hold your hands up, and take no shit or whatever.
Right.
And John had him come over to the island to help him with their program a little bit and oversee and everything else. Well, Bob ends up going back to the Keys, and he turns around and hears, and I tell Bob this, he says, aren't you a little afraid of people, aren't you? And I said, yeah, he said, they're going to hate you. They're going to hate you. I'm going to hate you, And I said, well, he said, who asked you to do this? I said, Bruce Miller. He said, so how are you supposed to? I said, Bruce said he's going to show me, some stuff. He says, can I go with you?
That's really funny.
So he does. And the day we go, it's just muddy as shit. You can't see anything. So we drive all the way from the Ocean Reef all the way up to the Raggeds and Boca Chica and all the way down. You can't see nothing.
Right.
I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, there's a big bank here. It's just foam, and he's in a bay boat or some bigger boat or something,
right.
And so we get back and he hands me one of those old, aerial shots. In those days, there's no Google Earth or something. It's like an air. And he says, there you go. And I'm like, okay.
That's showing me the Keys.
That was it. But, the thing that got me was, the thing that I was really afraid of was the other guides. So if I saw somebody, I didn't go near him, and I knew who Bob Branham was. I knew the guides. I had heard that they were my idols, it was like, holy shit. I used to ask like Bruce, who's the best guide down here? Branham.
Yeah.
And was
Mark
Bill Curtis guiding at the time?
Yes, and I knew Bill pretty well. Got to know Bill over the years, especially because he got involved with BTT, right. And we used to. And I've got Bill Curtis stories too, but but I was afraid, and so I didn't want to see anybody. I didn't want to piss anybody off. I didn't want to go near them, and that was the thing. Andy Thompson lasted, I think, a year or something. Then he wanted to go on his own, and Andy and I fished a lot together. We just, if we had a day off or whatever, right. We were fishing, and Andy, when he quit the reef and everything else, he started spending a lot of time in the Everglades, and I would go to the Everglades with Andy. That was our time,
sure.
To fish and, goof around. And that's the thing down here. It was through time, it was the friendships of the people that accepted, finally, mm-hmm. Bob Rich helped a lot with that because I met Bob and everything else. And we started fishing a little together. I met Borski before Bob, and Borski and I hooked up right away.
You knew Borski before Borski became Borski.
That's right. And Tim, I just loved him. I mean, they
yes,
broke the mold.
For sure.
And we had some times. I mean, a lot of them were good drinking times, but I mean, I remember going to the Everglades with Borski and a couple of 6-packs and a pair of clippers, because we were going to go to, clip our way into the jungle, and it just great times. And Borski, was like, let's go try this or let's go here, and so some of those early friendships, and then the Redbone. The Redbone, when it started, that's how I met, Craig Brewer and all these, Rusty Auberry, and it just goes, and the friendships. And that was the thing that was really cool, was that I never had confrontations. I stayed away from everybody. But once you sort of got accepted and, it was like, all right, And
right.
and the friendships developed, Justin Ray down here, Will Benson, and I've known these guys for years, and it's like we fish together, we'll do a lot of stuff, but I respect places. I ain't going back there.
Right.
It's
who likes to fish in a certain area.
Yeah, so it's like that's great stuff. We had a great time there and everything else. And to me, the fun is the hunt. It's going out and figuring it out. That's sort of okay, here's the spot. But Steve Huff told me years ago, a couple of things, we're talking, and he said, I try to look at a new spot every day. Every day I want to go out and just look at it. And I thought, that's pretty good.
They just don't tell their anglers the next hour is a spot they've never seen. Harry told me that as well.
Yeah.
Every day was allocated towards finding something different.
Yeah.
Especially in the early years, because everything's new, but once you get better, you still need to, develop your arsenal, if you will.
Yeah. It's like Flip. I asked Flip, I said, Flip, and this is when we were filming the Chronicles in 95 or 96, whatever it was. And I said, Flip, if you had one, suggestion, or one thing that you, think is important, in guiding or whatever, what would it be? And he sat there and he thought, and he said, don't run into fish's house. Right. And I thought, that is so true. And I have a big pet peeve about it now. And up north a lot, right. Because the fish that I'm looking for up north and the stripers and everything, in order to get the big fish on a fly, I am going into areas really like, I've got it on my contender. If I'm going after big fish, I've got a little, it's like a drive. So I just click it, and now it's just barely moving, but it's like
kind of like a trolling motor.
It's like a trolling motor speed. So I might have to go a half a mile into these areas with it. I had guys recently like, why don't you just go? Right. It's like, dude, he's like, my guide, we just go into these, It's like, no, you sneak in here.
Right.
To, how many big fish you catch with that guy? Well, no, I've never caught any. Well,
that's why. How would the Swordfish put up with those stick boats running up on top of them and throwing harpoons into their backs?
Well, first of all, they were spotted by planes usually.
But the boat is still motoring up on that fish. I think the motor would scare a big swordfish.
Well, I think a lot of times they're literally, almost in swordfish sleeping mode.
Oh, okay.
So they would chug up, they'd glide into them, they'd
Slowly
see the approach, and the plane oftentimes is telling them, okay, he's right in front of you at 11 o'clock, turn forward, here he could, and they could see the fin or whatever. But it's just a night. And the thing that you find out, and Bruce, Miller, who, blesses, I don't like the way that he fishes, with the trolling motors and everything else. It's not my style,
right?
But he used to tell me, you can't turn off if you're doing an engine, a trolling motor, or anything else. As long as the sound stays constant,
you're fine.
You're fine.
You're right.
The minute you turn it off, or you change things, or switch gears, or do something, then that's when they're going to spook because of the change.
Right. Tell me about the time you sank a boat.
I knew this one. Here we go.
Well, you didn't sink it, but the ocean did.
Yeah, wasn't me. It's funny because I listened to Harry Spear talking, his accident too that we've all had. I don't think you can be out there and not, one time or another after all these years that you're not going to have, things. That's the sea. But so one day I've got two very well-known writers, Phil Caputo and John Katzenbach. And Phil Caputo is, wrote the Rumors of War, and really, really good fishermen, really good guys, and so we're sitting. We come around the point and everything else, and there's a blitz of bass taking place on a beach in front of us, but they're too tight. So I sit there and I said, "You guys, those fish will probably come out of here. Let's just sit."
It's too shallow up in there.
It's too shallow and it's rocky and it's too tight. It's So I said, we'll just sit here and, and wait, see if they'll come out. So we're sitting there and they're on the front talking and everything else. And I'm on the back, and I always keep the boat, or I'll touch it to reverse, because we're just looking at it. And we're sitting way outside. The surf is inside, it's breaking. So we're sitting there and everything. And the next thing I know, I'm turn around like this, and out of the corner I see this swell coming. It's like, what the, So I put it in reverse, and I'm like, what is this thing gonna? I said, hey, you guys, hold on, and the next thing, this swell comes up behind me, and it just crests, and it breaks in the back of the boat. And I'm like, holy Jesus, and it didn't, it wasn't like but it filled the back of the boat with water, and so at that point I'm like, okay, I think we're okay, because I'm trying to move forward and get but it was a sea craft, and sea craft has their scuppers at the very bottom of the boat, and as I learned later, they call them sink crafts. So anyway,
so the scupper. Tell people what a scupper is. It's a drain.
Scupper is the drain in the
Right.
back of the boat, the two holes that if you get water in the boat, they come back out. Most scuppers are out of the side or whatever. Sea crafts are down, way down low.
Right.
So if the weight of the boat
Has those
gets
underwater,
weight,
yeah.
now the scuppers are underwater and the water's going no place. And if anything, depending, it's going to come in. So the water starts coming in, and the boat slowly just starts rolling, and we're like, you got to be kidding me. And it just rolls over. And so, we're all fine, everything's floating, and we basically swim to shore,
Oh, God.
Well, so it ends up that there's a hurricane off of Bermuda that, nobody was aware that the hurricane sends out these swells away, and they lost 5 boats that day. The Block Island, people were anchored, having their sun, and they totally ended up on the rocks and inside. So it was
A rogue wave.
a rogue wave.
Nikki, tell them about our rogue wave.
Yeah, I was gonna say you got flipped off a boat on a rogue wave.
Yeah, we were shark fishing up near Palm Beach when the black-tip spinner sharks were in shallow water, the migration. So we would chum them up with bait and throw flies at these spinner sharks. So I've got a trolling motor on the bow of my egret, and I'm sitting on the phone up in the bow. Beautiful day. And there's a bunch of bait guys up on the shore maybe trying to catch pompano. And they're pissed because we're probably a little bit too close, right? But all the sharks are in this trough. So I'm on the trolling motor on the bow, and we're waiting to chum up a fish, right? And Nikki's in the back of the boat. And I'm on my phone looking towards the shore, looking for sharks. And all of a sudden, Nikki goes, "Look out!" And I turn around, and the wall of water was like up here. And I was underwater like that.
You did a backflip. I remember you did a backflip. The wave crashed. It was all white water.
The boat's sideways. Nikki almost got launched.
Yeah, and the wave crashed, and it's after the whole debacle, and I'm just looking for my dad, and all I hear is. I knew it was his head in the hole of the boat.
I come up and hit my head in the hole of the boat. I got a big cut in my chin, and I get up. Thank God the boat didn't flip. And I heard this noise, and I look over, and all the guys on the beach are clapping. Yeah!
And then we go to the hospital because you had to get stitches on your chin. I remember the guy called you back who was on the phone with you, and you go, "What happened to you? It sounded like you went underwater."
And I'm driving down the road with a big old hole in my chin, a big old flap. I'm just going to rip this fucking thing off, Nikki's going, no. But as we close out this great conversation, you were telling me at one point during this podcast, you were at a point where you were not really sure you were going to make it past 30. Tell me about that time and how you got out of it.
Oh. I thought I was out of it. If you grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and everything else, it was sort of a counterculture time, and the Vietnam War was going on, the drugs came about, hippie, the whole thing. And at a very early age, of course, everybody, was involved with, drugs, and it sort of mushrooms, and the people that on the water, and the if you were fishing and you were on the water or surfing or doing this and that, everything else, it was almost like an evolution. And everybody, myself included or whatever, I started at a very young age of getting involved with what they call now is the cannabis industry. But, and it just, it was sort of a progression, and We used our boating skills and flying and everything else, and that's sort of what happened. I spent half my time in Mexico, fishing, but doing other things, and so it was just sort of that era.
Right, but as far as alcoholism and drug stuff like that, you personally too said, I'm just going to wipe my hands clean of everything.
Yes,
that's what I was worried about. Not so much getting hit running drugs and getting killed that way, but maybe just ending up drinking too much, and all of a sudden you're toast.
There was no doubt. My family had a history of alcoholism. And so. Nathaniel, is a really good friend. I've known him before he started down here in Connecticut and everything else. And we all have our demons and and in my family, alcoholism was one of them. And I almost burned my whole career down. And I see it now because with a lot of other guides and everything, because it's very easy. It's such a great sport, and there's such great camaraderie, and it's after the day on the water, and you want to talk about it, and you want to party with your friends, and it gets into a vicious cycle. At least it did for me.
Right.
And so I got to a point where the drinking was just out of control. It was a full blown, it was nasty. And finally, I got to a point where a couple of incidents happened, DWI and everything else, and it was a wake up call. And I just couldn't, it was like, that's it. I can't do this anymore. I wish I'd done it much earlier in life, and figured it out then,
But at least you got it when you did.
Yeah, and so it's and I, like I said, I have friends and everything else that are young guides and everything, and I sort of see the same thing. It's so easy to get into that fish party until it wears you down, and then it's like, oh boy,
it's too late.
Yeah, so it's the best thing I ever did. Like I said, I just wish
Yeah, but maybe your friends just don't like you as much anymore.
Well, they don't.
How many friends did you lose when you stopped drinking?
It's funny because
where'd they go?
Joe Blados, who invented the crease fly or whatever, is a dear friend. I've known him since those days of the Pirates Party and everything. Every time I see Joe, he's like, "You drinking yet?" I say, "No, Joe." He's like, "Damn it, you were so much fun."
As we wrap this up, you've had a great relationship with conservation. Not only with the striped bass, but in raising money to help these fish stay alive and keep swimming and preserve what you know and what you care about. Tell me about the time and when we were working together when you were honored with the Isaac Walton Award this last year, and I was hosting the event. I asked you, when did you first realize that you were connected with conservation and the preservation of fish? And you told me about your father when you were a very young man. Can you retell that story?
Yeah, I tell people everybody says, the worst thing you want to hear is, oh boy, you should have been here yesterday. And as I tell people, no, that's not it. The worst story that you want to hear is I remember when. And I remember when my father going out of the harbor, in Newport Beach, and I was probably 10, 12 years old or whatever. And he turned around and he said, I remember when I used to catch longfin albacore off those jetties. At that time we were going 100 miles to get them, So, for me, I just got involved with the conservation and everything because it was a necessity. It was like, okay, this is, if you wanted to, so it's like, that's stupid. These laws that they're making there, this is crazy, and I wanted to help. It's like the, American Saltwater Guides Association, I just joined with these guys, like-minded anglers 3 years ago. And they said, look, we need a new voice. The striped bass is getting crushed. It's absurd what's happening. And the governing body that governs, each state gets a representative that governs the states and what happens to the stripers. it's political, and everybody is conflicted because one state wants the commercial fisher. We got to be able to kill them. The other one is, so there's no cohesive. So the Guides Association idea is there needs to be another voice heard. And the other voice is of the people that want more fish in the water, that enjoy catching them. And it's not saying that you can't necessarily kill them, but let's have a robust stock. Let's not kill them to oblivion till we're in trouble again, which is, I never thought that I would see the striped bass collapse like it has. I thought, man, look at this, the greatest conservation success story of all time. And now we're back to 20 years later. Same
It's
thing.
amazing how people can allow that to happen.
It's just mind-boggling.
I mean, they saved it.
I know.
And then they allowed it to die again.
And it's it's like the captains for clean water. It's finally, we've had enough. And who doesn't get clean water? Richard Nixon was the one that put in the Clean Water Act and the things like, hey, instead of dumping in rivers, maybe we should think about this. Well, look at, these families, these two families in Florida that control the sugar industry. And then you think, like, how much is enough? How much money do you need? You're destroying what everybody comes to Florida for. The reef is dead. The Everglades is dying. The rivers are channeled. And it's like, when is it enough? And now people, because of what's happening with the channels and pumping and seeing algae blooms in their backyard, now they're starting to say, well, wait a second here. Maybe there's something to be said. And so for me, I want my kids. I don't want to be like my dad and say, I remember when. To me, it's all about the, what our future is. It's you. It's Nikki and my son Austin and Andrew, that love to fish and get it. They're the guys that are, the upcoming generation. And maybe they'll fix it. But I'm sure going to try to have something for them to keep fixing.
Right.
So to me, it's just, it comes hand in hand. You can't love the outdoors and you can't love what Mother Nature gave you without getting involved. And if you're not, you better, because it's not going to be there. There's too many, and I hate saying this because, everybody used to talk about population control. Not anymore, they don't. Maybe it's not political correct or what, I don't know, but the world, the population is exploding and everybody wants to use the resources. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as there's something to use.
Right.
And
it's got to be sustainable.
That's it, and it's like, I don't want to say, hey, you can't have dirt bikes in the parks or this, but there's got to be a limit. There's got to be some boundaries that we start setting if we want to preserve this thing, let alone what's going on with climate change.
Right.
There's a lot of problems, but, and that's why I just have to get involved, because it's like, okay, I'm going to fight. It maybe, it's going nowhere. I don't know, but at least
you're in the fight.
At least in my heart, I know I tried, and
Yeah.
that's the important thing.
So up in the Northeast right now with striped bass, are you guys pushing for another moratorium?
Well, I would love it. I wish they would have never opened it in the first place back in, in 90 whatever. I wish that it just stayed moratorium forever because it would be unbelievable, But yes, I would like to see a moratorium. But politically, it's very hard. Because, and this is what the Guides Association is trying to do, is work this political thing and get people involved. Because, like, there's an Amendment 7 coming up that's going to determine what's going to happen with stripers. And if any angler isn't out there that's fishing for stripers and doesn't go on this public comment that is happening over the next 6 months until April, then, don't, when the fish disappear, which they are. I had a conversation at 6 o'clock this morning on a conference call with these guys that are up in Massachusetts and all these different, there is no bass. That comes for a short time, they're gone. and it's like you have to get involved or it's going to disappear. And there's too many conflicting, the politics of it. So when you say, one of the great things, like Brad Burns, a great guy that, started Stripers Forever 25 years ago or whatever, it's a great concept, make it a game fish. And I would love to make it a game fish. But in reality, because of the way that the states are structured and this governing organization is put together, the politics, they won't even talk to you. If you say, oh, we're going to make it a game fish, and I hope that's where it goes. But at this point in this juncture in time, it's the little steps that we can do. To get involved with, at least let the public know that there's a problem. Mm-hmm. Because when you see, if you're at Montauk at the blitzes, you don't think there's a problem. It's like, look at all these fish. You go to New York and New Jersey when all the fish end up down in front of New York and New Jersey, and there's 10,000 boats out there trying to get these fish. There doesn't seem to be a problem. Look at all these big fish. But they're just in areas. You're seeing the body of the fish that represents the whole East Coast in that one area.
Yeah.
And that's
There's a great adage, I don't know where it came from, but it's, there are none so blind than those who will not see.
Yeah.
And that's what breaks my heart, because if you stand back and take a look from afar, it's pretty friggin' obvious how badly they're messing up.
Yeah.
But people have got their foot in commercial fishing and the killing, and the recreational guys, they want to kill. It's like, hey, less is more. More is not more.
Yeah. But it's the price tag.
Yeah.
The minute you put a price tag on something, it's over.
Like like the sugar in the water in South Florida.
Yeah.
What they're battling right now up in Tallahassee, same thing.
Yeah, the politicians and the being bought out by money and everything. The thing that they just what was it? The thing that they tried to pass through yesterday, the captains, everybody raced to Tallahassee.
Right.
It's a travesty. They're trying to stick let's reward this and get it through quickly and
steal $600 million from what was supposed to be accounted for.
Yeah,
and allocated to preserving them. What we need with the Florida water and the Everglades and the preservation of all the birds and the alligators and the wildlife and the fish and the water quality, as you mentioned.
And you got to think, what is the corruption? How did that come about? Who tried to do this?
Right.
Who's the guy behind the door that's saying, hey, sneak this in here so we can, forget that because we got to build up there. We got to, grow more sugar, whatever it is, the politics and the sort of the corruption and what money can buy, as far as like, hey, and I get it, people, it's their livelihoods. Commercial, I don't have anything against commercial fishing. We all eat fish and everything else, but
the sustainability of
it's got to be a balance.
That's right.
It's got to be sustainable.
That's got to be, when and they'll tell you, well, those scientists don't know anything. I got plenty of fish and everything. Well, then let's have some scientists on your boat. Listen, there's ways to do this, but if we all work together as concerned, stakeholders, then we can all make a difference. But as I told this hearing last year, I got lots of friends that are commercial fishing or working for hire boats and everything else, but it's all about the fish. And if there is no fish, we all don't have a job. So,
it's interesting in that fishery up there, it's about catch and kill. Whereas down here in South Florida, the water quality is killing the habitat, all the dead grass, all the algae blooms. So the fish has no longer a house that he can live in. So it's not only we're losing fish, we're losing the environment. Yeah. And it's affecting people that are not involved with fishing.
And that's the same thing in the Chesapeake.
Right.
That's what's happening there.
It's a bigger game than just fish.
That's right.
It's South Florida.
Yeah.
400 billion dollars are generated through fishing in the Florida Keys.
That's crazy.
450 billion, or is it million? I
It's
think
billion.
Yeah.
It's, from the tourism trade to the tackle sold, the boats, the guides, the businesses. It's just like in the Northeast. We had the film Hardline. And it points to, like, look at all this. When I first went to Montauk, it was John Applenap's dad's boat and myself. All the slips were empty. There was nobody, because there was no striped bass, so they were fishing, the commercial boats or whatever. They're fishing fluke or they're fishing porgies or whatever. When the striper came back this year in Montauk, the prices have skyrocketed.
Real estate, yeah.
Because the striper, brought everything back. All those boat sales and all these manufacturers and everything else, it's the striped bass. And it's driving all those local economies, just like it is here in the Keys, just like it is in the west or east coast of Florida.
Right.
It's the fishing and the recreation and the environment that's bringing the people. So why are you burning it down?
You know what? And I'm gonna end this here shortly. It's just like the cruise ships in Key West.
Yeah.
My God. Take a step back and take a look at the mass destruction
It's crazy.
to this paradise.
And don't let me get going on cruise ships,
I
because,
know.
man, I've been a fighter of cruise ships since the days that I used to travel to Bali and, back in the 70s and stuff.
Well, that's another podcast. But for now, I want to wrap this up because there's so much more to say and so much more to cover, because your life is your spectrum is just outrageous. And I can't tell you how much appreciative I am of not only our friendship, but what kind of contribution you've given to the sport and to conservation. And that's why you are so profoundly acknowledged and respected.
Well, that's
I really appreciate
very kind words, Andy. You and Nikki Poons.
Polly Poons.
I love you guys. We've had some quality time together. You and I met years back and everything else, and we've really had some great adventures. And the fishing, to me, this whole sport is the people you meet and the camaraderie. That's the best of it, right? Because it's the passion and the sharing of that passion that it's the kind. I can't wait. It's like going to Harker's Island. It was like this gathering, guys. It was like the Pirates Party. It was like the motherships that we've done together.
Sure.
It's all these, these adventures and these people that you've grown to love and that share this passion. To me, that's what makes my heart glad.
The fish are the byproduct.
Yeah, it's
of a great time.
It absolutely, and it's getting.
But
out
we're
there
there because of the fish, obviously. But it's such a great combination of heartfelt friendship and a great fish that we're chasing around the world. And take a look at fishing and how big it is.
Oh,
people want to be fishing. Fish live in great houses all around the world.
Yep.
So, God, we have to just, I think, take a step back where it's fragile and try to think how we can make it sustainable and save everything.
Yeah. Amen.
Bring awareness to the issues.
Yes, indeed.
I love you, dude.
I love you too, man.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks
Dude.
so much.
Thanks, you guys.
So great. Thank you so much.
You betcha.
What I saw is West Side Story. What I saw is just a